The modern world is very like the 18th century. People keep saying, "Oh, we're going back to the 1930s," but for me, the Theresian 18th century is very similar to today. You have, in geopolitical terms, even the same territory being partitioned. We call it Ukraine today, but it was Poland in her day.
Interesting. What other aspects of the modern age would be quite similar to the 18th century?
Well, I think the fact that there's a massive debate now in Europe on how to modernize and finance an army, that would have been a question she would have recognized. The fact that alliances which seemed set in stone in the 18th century, no one ever thought Austria would form an alliance with France. In the same way, today, no one ever thought that Russia and America would seem to be forming an entente at the very least. So that's another sort of diplomatic similarity. And then you also have this tremendous sort of feeling that we're again returning to a period of empires, age of empires, where blocks or countries or whatever you want to call them today wish to exert their spheres of influence. And agreements as to what those spheres of influence should be are done at a high monarchical level, if you like.
Because you have all the context in which someone could ever hope for from the 18th century and perhaps even beyond, do you look at the modern world and find a sense of calm because it's a cyclical way of human nature and empires, etc.? Or do you find reason to panic?
Reason to panic. Why should one panic? Everything that's happening today we've seen before. As I said, Maria Theresa would have seen it as a very familiar kind of landscape, what's going on today. So I think cometh the hour, cometh the man, one would hope, or woman. Um, I mean, the negotiating skills of all the countries that presently make up either the European Union, the American bloc, and the Russian bloc will be tested uh, very severely over the coming months. But that doesn't mean that they won't reach some form of agreement. Um, and I personally don't subscribe to the idea that the world is about to come to an end, and this collective clutching of pearls, as someone once described it, I think is probably not really necessary.
The 18th century was a very militaristic age. To what ends did she use her army and why did she need to rebuild it?
Well, she comes to the throne, as I said, at the age of 23, and her father um, knew that the domains would be contested precisely because she was a woman. And so he set about getting all the countries of Europe, England, France, Prussia, Saxony, Spain, to sign what was known as the Pragmatic Sanction, which essentially said, we agree that your daughter should inherit the throne rather than the daughters of the previous emperor, and rather than anyone else. Now, rather like today, where you have a situation in the Ukraine where not so long ago Mr. Putin offered to guarantee the integrity of the Ukraine and then promptly forgot about it and invaded. A similar situation happened when she came to the throne. Suddenly, Bavaria, encouraged by France, then Prussia, then Saxony, then Spain, all made a land grab. And in order to see those forces off, she needed a strong army, which she didn't have at first. But with her powers of discernment, she found these brilliant generals who could actually eventually save the day. But it was going to take a long time, a good 10 years.
Is this the time where she said she felt forsaken by the majority of Europe?
Yes, she was forsaken. The only people who were not interested in taking any of her domains were the English, but they just always counselled compromise and surrender. And indeed, 3 times she was forced to make peace with her arch rival, Frederick of Prussia, by the British, because the British were always worried that because they had Hanoverian kings, the Prussian army would march one day into Hanover. So they were very, very appeasement oriented, and so everyone really was against her at first. But as I say, she chose brilliant advisors, and the constellation, which was so hostile to her, became much more favourable as time progressed.
So, she is a young monarch. She feels forsaken, but sees off a lot of shenanigans from neighboring countries. What else then happens in the younger to middle-aged years of our Empress?
Well, I think she's pretty determined that her domains must be made fit for purpose. So she introduces a system of public health, one of the first ever in Europe, in certainly mainland Europe. And she also overhauls the educational system, providing compulsory primary school education for most of her subjects, but also insisting that at the other end of the educational scale at the universities, there should be no relaxation of high standards. And one of her, I think, most poignant remarks, again, very relevant today, given the massive overexpansion of higher education, is when she says, yes, if we lower standards, we'll end up with an academic proletariat. And we don't want that.
To what extent is she different? Obviously, in the very sense that she was a monarch and Napoleon was and wasn't. What extent is she different? Because Napoleon very much introduced a lot of laws and education, health, etc. Was she just 100 years ahead of the time?
In many ways, I think she was. I think Napoleon is much more radical, of course. And Napoleon, in his military campaigns, really does remake the map of Europe. And that was never an intention of Maria Theresa. She would like always to hold on to her territories, but generally she was against expansionism or tinkering too much with the map of her domains, let alone the rest of Europe. Whereas Napoleon, of course, was a revolutionary figure in every way, and although he does negotiate a concordat with the Vatican, he's very much riding a tide of French anti-clericalism.